Chapter 1. A Curious Inheritance. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage at St. Mary Mead, carefully tending to her knitting as the afternoon post arrived. The gentle click of her needles provided a soothing rhythm as she contemplated the peculiar letter that had arrived that morning. The solicitor's missive had been most unexpected. Millicent Deering, a distant cousin whom she had met perhaps twice in her lifetime, had apparently remembered her in her will. Most curious, Miss Marple murmured to herself, her pale blue eyes momentarily lifting from her work to gaze out the window at her beloved garden, where late summer bloom still offered splashes of color against the encroaching autumn. I scarcely knew the woman. Miss Marple had always prided herself on her memory for people, and Millicent flitted through her recollections as a tall, somewhat austere woman, with a keen interest in botany. They had corresponded occasionally over the years, Christmas cards and the rare letter discussing unusual flowering plants. Millicent had moved to a remote village some 15 years ago, and their already tenuous connection had dwindled further. The letter mentioned that Miss Marple had inherited Gossamer Cottage in its entirety, along with all its contents. The solicitor, a Mr. Penderby, had included the keys within the envelope and had requested she visit his office in Lower Misting at her earliest convenience to finalize the arrangements. "I suppose," she said aloud to her tabby cat Tiddlywinks, who watched her with unblinking yellow eyes, "that I ought to see what this is all about." Within a week, Miss Marple had packed a modest suitcase, arranged for her neighbor Miss Knight to feed Tiddlywinks, and taken the train to Paddington. From there, she traveled to the picturesque county of Somerset and finally hired a local taxi to convey her the remainder of the journey to Lower Misting. The village appeared charming enough as the automobile wound its way through narrow lanes hedged with brambles and wild roses. Quaint stone cottages clustered around a small green, with a medieval church presiding over the scene like a stern grandmother. Miss Marple noticed, however, that unlike many villages she had visited, the locals did not pause to regard the passing vehicle with curiosity. Instead, they seemed to deliberately avert their eyes or hurry about their business with unusual haste. "That's Gossamer Cottage up ahead, ma'am," said the driver, a taciturn man who had offered little conversation during their journey. "Bit isolated, if you don't mind my saying." The cottage stood apart from the village proper, nestled at the edge of a small copse of silver birch trees. It was a sturdy structure of honey-colored stone with a thatched roof and leaded windows, the kind of dwelling that might appear in illustrated fairy tale books. A stone path, now partly overgrown with wild thyme and lavender, led to the blue-painted front door. "I'll just wait to make sure you get in all right," the driver said, placing her suitcase on the path. There was something in his tone, not quite concern, but a wireness, that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Billings, ma'am." Tom Billings. Miss Marple approached the cottage, noting the slightly neglected garden which nevertheless showed signs of having once been meticulously tended. A stone bird bath stood in the center of what had been a formal herb garden, and several rose bushes, now wild and untrimmed, climbed the southern wall. The key turned smoothly in the lock, revealing a dim interior that smelled faintly of dust, dried herbs, and something else, a peculiar, almost metallic scent that Miss Marple couldn't immediately identify. She stepped inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the gloom. "Is everything all right then, ma'am?" called Mr. Billings from his position by the gate. "Yes, thank you. Quite all right," she replied, though she felt a curious sensation, almost a warning, as she crossed the threshold. After Mr. Billings departed, Miss Marple took stock of her surroundings. The cottage was larger than it appeared from outside, with a spacious sitting room featuring exposed oak beams and a large stone fireplace. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on botany, local folklore, and village histories. A writing desk positioned beneath the window overlooked the back garden, which appeared to be even more overgrown than the front. As Miss Marple moved through the cottage, she noticed something odd about the door frames. Leaning closer, she discovered faint symbols etched into the wood, peculiar markings that resembled nothing she had ever seen before. They appeared to be very old, possibly predating the cottage itself. "How very strange," she murmured, tracing one of the symbols with her fingertip. The kitchen was a charming space with a large range cooker and stone sink. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and ceramic jars labeled in a neat hand lined the shelves. Miss Marple opened one and sniffed at the contents, lavender, still fragrant despite its age. Upstairs she found 2 bedrooms, each simply furnished with heavy oak pieces that must have been quite old indeed. The larger room, evidently Millicent's, contained a collection of pressed flowers arranged in frames on the wall. Miss Marple examined them with interest, noting that rather than being arranged for aesthetic appeal, they seemed positioned in specific patterns that hinted at some sort of meaning. "Curious," she said softly. "Most curious indeed." After unpacking her modest belongings, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Mr. Penderby before the day grew too late. She refreshed herself with a cup of tea. Thankfully, the electricity was still connected, and set out for the village, careful to lock the door behind her. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being observed. Twice she turned suddenly, but caught no one following her. The path into the village proper was lovely, winding between ancient trees that whispered secrets in the gentle autumn breeze. Penderby's office was situated above the village post office, accessed by a narrow staircase that made Miss Marple grateful for her walking stick. The solicitor himself was a thin man with round spectacles and a perpetually worried expression. "Miss Marple, yes, do come in," he said, rising from behind his cluttered desk. "I trust you found the cottage without difficulty." "Indeed I did, Mr. Penderby, though I must say, I'm rather puzzled by this inheritance. Cousin Millicent and I were hardly close." Penderby shuffled some papers and cleared his throat. "Yes, well, Miss Deering was quite specific in her will. The cottage and all its contents are yours, along with a modest sum for its upkeep." He paused, seemingly uncomfortable. Miss Deering had no other living relatives, you see, and the circumstances of her death. Miss Marple inquired gently. "Natural causes," Penderby replied, perhaps too quickly. "Heart failure, according to Dr. Simmons. She was found in her garden one morning, very peaceful by all accounts." Miss Marple nodded, though she detected a certain reticence in the solicitor's manner, and the symbols carved into the door frames. "Do you know anything about those?" At this, Penderby's discomfort visibly increased. "Old superstitions, nothing more. This part of Somerset has many curious folk traditions. Miss Deering had an interest in such things." "I see," said Miss Marple, though she was not entirely satisfied with this explanation. "Well, I shall make myself comfortable at Gossamer Cottage for a few days at least, while I decide what is to be done with the property." As she prepared to leave, Penderby hesitated, then said in a lower voice, "Miss Marple, Lower Misting is a close-knit community with some unusual customs. It might be best not to inquire too deeply into local matters." Miss Marple smiled her deceptively vague smile. "I'm just a curious old woman, Mr. Penderby. I assure you I have no intention of disrupting village life." As she made her way back to the cottage, the setting sun cast long shadows across the path. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger now, and Miss Marple's instincts, honed by a lifetime of observing the darker aspects of human nature, told her that there was more to Millicent's death and this inheritance than a simple case of a distant relative remembering her in a will. Gossamer Cottage waited ahead, its windows reflecting the golden light of sunset. Whatever secrets it held, Miss Marple was determined to uncover them, one careful observation at a time. Chapter 2. The Village Whispers. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Gossamer Cottage, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like ethereal messengers. Miss Marple had spent a rather restless night, disturbed by the unfamiliar creaks and sighs of the old building. She was not, as a rule, a fanciful woman, but there was something about the cottage that seemed to resonate with untold stories. After a simple breakfast of toast and tea, Miss Marple decided to acquaint herself with lower misting properly. She dressed carefully in her tweed skirt, cardigan and sensible walking shoes, collecting her handbag and the keys to the cottage. As she stepped outside, she noticed a cluster of foxgloves growing beside the path, their speckled throats like silent sentinels guarding the approach to the cottage. The village appeared more welcoming in the morning light. A small grocery shop, a tea room, the post office, and the church formed the center of village life. Miss Marple's first destination was the tea room, a quaint establishment called the Briar Rose, where she hoped to gather some initial impressions of the locals. The bell above the door tinkled softly as she entered. Conversation, which had been flowing easily among the few patrons, faltered briefly as all eyes turned to regard the newcomer. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and selected a table near the window, which afforded a good view of both the village green and the interior of the establishment. "Good morning," said a plump woman in an apron approaching her table. "What can I get for you?" "A pot of Darjeeling, if you have it, and perhaps a scone," Miss Marple replied. The woman nodded, studying Miss Marple with unconcealed curiosity. "You're staying at Gossamer Cottage, aren't you?" "Millicent's relative?" "Indeed I am. Miss Jane Marple, Millicent's cousin. And you are?" "Mrs. Porter." "Agnes Porter. I run the Briar Rose with my husband Thomas." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I was sorry to hear about Millicent. She was, well, she kept to herself mostly, but she was always polite when she came in for tea." Miss Marple noted the careful choice of words. "Yes, it was most unexpected. I understand she passed away in her garden." Mrs. Porter's eyes darted quickly to the other patrons. "That's right. Dr. Simmons found her when he came to deliver some medicine for her arthritis. Heart gave out, they say." "I see. And had she been ill for long?" Not that anyone mentioned. Mrs. Porter fidgeted with her apron. "I'll just get your tea." As the woman bustled away, Miss Marple observed the other customers. An elderly man with a weather-beaten face sat alone in the corner, nursing a cup of something that was likely stronger than tea. A middle-aged couple conversed in hushed tones at a table across the room, occasionally glancing in her direction. Mrs. Porter returned with the tea and a freshly baked scone with clotted cream and strawberry jam. "Here you are. Will you be staying long at the cottage?" "I haven't quite decided," Miss Marple replied, pouring her tea with a steady hand. "I knew very little about Cousin Millicent's life here. Perhaps you could tell me, did she have any particular friends in the village?" Mrs. Porter hesitated. "Well, she spent time with Mrs. Thorne. She's our local herbalist, lives on the edge of the village in the other direction from your cottage, and she often spoke with Reverend Hastings about local history. Millicent was very interested in the village's past, you see." "Was she indeed? How fascinating." "Yes, always asking questions about old stories, legends, and such, especially about the cottage." Mrs. Porter lowered her voice further. "Some folk weren't too pleased about her digging up old tales, the best left buried, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple took a thoughtful sip of her tea. "I'm afraid I don't quite understand. What sort of tales?" But Mrs. Porter straightened abruptly as the bell above the door announced another customer. "Ah, Dr. Simmons, your usual table is free." The doctor was a tall, spare man with iron-grey hair and a penetrating gaze that immediately sought out Miss Marple. He approached her table with deliberate steps. "You must be Miss Marple," he said without preamble. "I'm Dr. Edward Simmons. I attended your cousin in her final hours." "How do you do, Dr. Simmons?" Miss Marple replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Would you care to join me?" The doctor sat, ordering only coffee when Mrs. Porter hovered nearby. Once they were alone, he studied Miss Marple with clinical detachment. "I understand from Penderby that you're Millicent's sole heir, as strange as she never mentioned any family during all her years here." "We were not close," Miss Marple admitted, "which makes this inheritance all the more surprising." Perhaps you could tell me a little about her life here and the circumstances of her passing." Simmons' expression remained impassive. Millicent Deering was an intelligent woman with an inquiring mind. She moved here 15 years ago and largely kept to herself, except when pursuing her research interests. "Research?" Miss Marple inquired. "Local folklore, primarily. She was particularly interested in the history of certain properties in the area, including Gossamer Cottage itself." He stirred his coffee methodically. In the weeks before her death, she became increasingly excited about something she had discovered. She mentioned a breakthrough in her research, but was frustratingly vague about the details. "And her death, it was unexpected." Dr. Simmons's eyes narrowed slightly. "She had a previously undiagnosed heart condition, according to the post-mortem. I found her in the garden early one morning when I came to check on her rheumatism. She appeared peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep among her beloved plants." Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing. "You say appeared peaceful. Did you have reason to suspect otherwise?" A shadow passed across the doctor's face. "I am a man of science, Miss Marple. I deal in observable facts, not village superstitions. Millicent died of natural causes." "I see. And these village superstitions, would they have anything to do with the symbols carved into the door frames at Gossamer Cottage?" Dr. Simmons' coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "I would advise you not to place too much importance on such things. Rural communities often cling to old beliefs that have no basis in reality. Nevertheless, I find myself curious. What exactly was Millicent researching?" The doctor set down his cup with deliberate care. "I believe she was investigating an old local legend about a death that occurred many years ago. It's hardly worth your attention, Miss Marple. If you're wise, you'll arrange to sell the cottage and return to, where was it, St. Mary Mead, as soon as possible." Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion at the door drew their attention. A woman in her late 30s had entered, her face flushed with agitation. Her gaze swept the tea room until it alighted on Miss Marple, whereupon she marched directly to their table. "You're her, aren't you? The cousin who's taken over Gossamer Cottage." Her voice was pitched higher than normal, betraying her emotional state. "Miss Marple, yes. And you are?" "Vivian Wells. I'm the postmistress here." She cast a quick, almost apologetic glance at Dr. Simmons before continuing. "I need to speak with you privately, if possible." Dr. Simmons rose smoothly. "I have patients to attend to, Miss Marple. It was illuminating to meet you. Do consider what I said about selling the cottage." With a curt nod, he departed, leaving Miss Marple alone with the agitated postmistress. Miss Wells slid into the vacated chair, leaning forward urgently. "Listen to me. There have been unnatural happenings at that cottage. Millicent knew it. She was getting close to something important before she died." "Unnatural happenings?" Miss Marple echoed, her pale blue eyes sharp with interest. Miss Wells glanced around nervously. Strange lights in the garden at night, unusual plants growing where nothing was planted, and the symbols, their protective marks, you know, ancient signs against evil. Miss Marple considered the woman carefully. There was fear in her eyes, certainly, but also a gleam of excitement that reminded Miss Marple of her grandniece when sharing ghost stories. "Did Millicent discuss her research with you, Miss Wells?" "Not directly, but she received many old books and documents through the post. And once," she lowered her voice to a whisper, "once she told me she had discovered why the cottage was called Gossamer. She said it was named for something delicate yet strong that connected the past to the present, like a spider's web, invisible until the light catches it just so." Miss Marple found this curious phrasing intriguing. "And did she elaborate on this connection?" "No, but the very next day she received a letter that upset her greatly. She went quite pale when she read it at the counter. When I asked if she was all right, she just muttered something about the Squire's family and hurried out." "The Squire's family? Who might that be?" The Carmichaels, at the Manor House. Sir Philip Carmichael is our local magistrate. His family has owned land here for generations." Miss Wells hesitated. "Miss Marple, I don't mean to frighten you, but there are those in the village who say that Millicent's death wasn't as natural as it seemed, and now you're living in that cottage." Miss Marple patted the younger woman's hand reassuringly. "My dear, at my age one doesn't have much to fear, but I thank you for your concern." As she left the tea room some time later, Miss Marple's mind was busy sorting and cataloguing the information she had gathered. The village of Lower Misting, for all its picturesque charm, harbored undercurrents of tension and secrets long concealed. Whether these secrets had anything to do with poor Millicent's death remained to be seen. Her path took her past the church, a Norman structure with an ancient yew tree in its graveyard. On impulse, she turned through the lich gate and made her way among the weathered tombstones, searching for the freshest grave that might belong to her cousin. She found it beneath a spreading chestnut tree, a simple marker bearing Millicent's name and dates. But what caught Miss Marple's eye was the strange arrangement of flowers placed before the stone, a precise pattern of foxgloves, monkshood, and white lilies that seemed oddly familiar. Chapter 3. The Midnight Visitor. Evening descended upon Gossamer Cottage like a velvet shroud, shadows elongating across the garden, as Miss Marple prepared for her first night in residence. She had spent the afternoon examining her cousin's belongings more thoroughly, discovering little of immediate significance beyond a collection of local history books, heavily annotated in Millicent's precise handwriting. One volume in particular, Folklore and Superstitions of Somerset, contained numerous underlined passages about protective symbols and their purported efficacy against malevolent forces. Millicent had scribbled in the margin, "The marks match those at GC predate structure." Connection to the incident of 1874, Miss Marple prepared a simple supper, her mind preoccupied with the various threads she had gathered throughout the day. The residents of Lower Misting clearly harbored anxieties about Gossamer Cottage, anxieties that seemed to transcend mere superstition. Dr. Simmons' clinical dismissal of village fears contrasted sharply with Miss Wells's genuine alarm. And what of Mrs. Porter's careful evasions? Darkness fell completely as Miss Marple washed her dishes, the cottage windows reflecting her movements against the impenetrable blackness outside. The silence was profound, not the gentle quiet of St. Mary Mead, but a weighted stillness that seemed to press against the ancient walls. She made her customary cup of hot cocoa and carried it upstairs, pausing briefly to study one of the etched symbols on the bedroom doorframe. In the wavering candlelight, the mark seemed almost to shift and dance beneath her gaze. "Fanciful notions," she murmured to herself, entering the bedroom that had been Millicent's. The framed flower arrangements on the wall captured her attention once more. Unlike typical Victorian pressed flower art, these specimens were arranged in distinct geometric patterns, triangles, circles, and more complex configurations that suggested purpose rather than aesthetic appeal. Miss Marple was reminded of the flowers she had seen on Millicent's grave that afternoon, foxglove, monkshood, and white lilies, arranged in a similar pattern. She settled into bed with one of Millicent's journals, but the spidery handwriting proved difficult to decipher in the dim light. Setting it aside, she extinguished the candle and allowed herself to drift towards sleep. The unfamiliar sounds of the cottage, the subtle creaking of timber, the occasional rustle from the garden, forming a nocturnal symphony around her. How long she had been asleep, Miss Marple couldn't precisely say, when she was startled awake by a sound that didn't belong to the natural repertoire of the old building. Footsteps, deliberate yet cautious, crunched on the gravel path outside. Fully alert now, Miss Marple rose quietly from the bed. Years of observing human nature had taught her that curiosity must sometimes be balanced with prudence. Rather than lighting a candle, which would announce her wakefulness to whoever prowled outside, she moved carefully to the window, positioning herself to one side where she could observe without being easily seen. The night was clear, the waning moon casting sufficient light to illuminate the garden. At first she saw nothing but the silver-touched outline of shrubs and the stone bird bath. Then a movement caught her eye. A figure dressed in dark clothing emerged from the shadows at the garden's edge. The figure, slight of build and moving with deliberate care, approached the cottage door. Miss Marple watched, scarcely breathing, as the nocturnal visitor bent to place something on the doorstep. A moment later, the figure straightened and turned slightly, allowing the moonlight to briefly illuminate the profile. It was a woman, her features indistinct at this distance, but her posture suggesting age. Before Miss Marple could make further observations, the woman melted back into the darkness, disappearing into the mist that had begun to gather in the low places of the garden. Miss Marple remained at the window for several minutes, ensuring the visitor had truly departed. Then, curiosity overcoming caution, she lit a candle and made her way downstairs. Her footfalls deliberately placed on the sections of staircase, less likely to creak. At the front door she hesitated, weighing the wisdom of opening it in the middle of the night. The rational part of her mind suggested waiting until morning, but something, perhaps the same intuition that had served her so well in past investigations, urged immediate action. Drawing a steadying breath, Miss Marple unlocked and opened the door, holding her candle aloft to illuminate the doorstep. There, precisely centered on the stone threshold, lay a single flower, an orchid of extraordinary beauty, its purple spotted white petals seeming to glow in the candlelight. Miss Marple recognized it as a rare variety, certainly not native to Somerset. Accompanying the blossom was a small folded piece of paper. With careful fingers, she retrieved both items and retreated inside, securing the door before unfolding the note. The message was brief, written in a shaky hand that suggested age or agitation. Leave before the new moon. Some secrets are best undisturbed. Miss Marple studied the cryptic warning, noting the absence of a signature. The paper itself was of good quality, the kind used for personal correspondence rather than common notes. She returned her attention to the orchid. A ghost orchid, if she wasn't mistaken, a species notoriously difficult to cultivate. She placed both items on the kitchen table and put the kettle on. Sleep would be elusive now, and she found that tea often helped order her thoughts. As the water heated, she retrieved Millicent's flower book from the shelf. If the pressed flower arrangements held some code or meaning, perhaps this midnight gift carried similar significance. The entry on ghost orchids confirmed their rarity and added the intriguing detail that in folklore they were believed to bloom only where a secret had been buried, a secret that sought revelation. In the Victorian language of flowers, they symbolized mystery and hidden truths. How very appropriate, Miss Marple murmured, sipping her tea and contemplating the blossom that seemed luminous, even in the warm lamplight. The warning to leave before the new moon gave her a definite time frame, 3 days, if her mental calendar was correct. Dawn found Miss Marple still at the kitchen table, the orchid preserved between the pages of her own notebook, and the warning note tucked safely in her cardigan pocket. She had spent the remaining night hours examining Millicent's flower arrangements more carefully, detecting a pattern that suggested a code of some kind, though its meaning remained obscure. After a brief rest and a reviving breakfast, she decided her next course of action would be to visit Mrs. Thorne, the herbalist mentioned by Mrs. Porter. If Millicent had been researching local folklore and rare plants, the herbalist seemed a logical connection. Miss Marple freshened herself and set out, following directions provided by an uncomfortable-looking young man at the village shop. Thorne's cottage lay on the opposite side of the village from Gossamer Cottage, nestled against the edge of woodland that rose toward distant hills. The herbalist's dwelling announced its purpose through the abundant and varied plants that filled its garden, orderly beds of medicinal herbs interspersed with more exotic specimens. Miss Marple recognized valerian, comfrey, and foxglove among the more common varieties. Her gentle knock was answered by a woman who might have been anywhere from 60 to 80 years of age. Her lined face suggested advanced years. but her movements retained the fluid grace of someone considerably younger. Sharp eyes, dark despite her age, assessed Miss Marple with unconcealed interest. "You'll be Millicent's cousin then," she said without preamble. "I've been expecting you. Come in." The interior of the cottage was aromatic, with drying herbs hanging from ceiling beams and shelves lined with jars of tinctures and powders. A tortoise-shell cat regarded Miss Marple indifferently from its perch near the hearth. "I am Eleanor Thorne," the woman said, gesturing Miss Marple to a chair near the unlit fireplace. "Millicent was a friend, one of the few in this village who didn't regard my interests as mere superstition. Miss Marple, Jane, I understand you and my cousin shared an interest in local plants and folklore." Mrs. Thorne's lips curved in a slight smile. "Direct, aren't you?" "Yes, we shared interests, though Millicent's research took a more specific direction in her final months." "Tea?" Without waiting for a response, she busied herself with a kettle already simmering on the hob. As she prepared the tea, she spoke over her shoulder in a deliberately casual tone that didn't fool Miss Marple for a moment. "You'll have noticed the symbols at Gossamer Cottage, I imagine, and perhaps experienced some unusual occurrences?" Miss Marple considered how much to reveal. "I found the carved marks curious, yes, and I received a visitor late last night who left an orchid and a rather cryptic warning." Mrs. Thorne turned sharply, her expression alert. "An orchid? A ghost orchid?" "Indeed, along with a note suggesting I depart before the new moon." The herbalist placed the teapot on the table with more force than necessary, her eyes narrowing. "Then it's beginning again, just as Millicent feared." And Chapter 4. The herbalist's secret, beginning again? Miss Marple repeated softly, her pale blue eyes never leaving Mrs. Thorne's face. "What precisely is beginning again, Mrs. Thorne?" The herbalist lowered herself into the chair opposite Miss Marple, her movement suddenly betraying the true burden of her years. The tortoise's shell cat, sensing the shift in atmosphere, abandoned its perch to wind about its mistress's ankles. "The past reaching into the present," Mrs. Thorne replied, her voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "Gossamer threads connecting what was to what is." Miss Marple accepted the cup of tea offered to her, noting the faint tremor in Mrs. Thorne's hands. The morning light filtering through the cottage windows caught the dust motes dancing in the air, creating an illusory veil between the two women that somehow seemed appropriate to their conversation. "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that my cousin discovered something of value hidden within Gossamer Cottage, something perhaps that others would prefer remained undiscovered." Mrs. Thorne's dark eyes widened slightly. "You're more perceptive than they'll expect," she murmured. "Yes, Millicent found something, or rather she was on the verge of finding it when..." She broke off abruptly, glancing toward the window as though checking for observers. "When she died," Miss Marple completed the thought, "a death that, despite Dr. Simmons' pronouncements, some believe was not entirely natural." A bitter smile twisted Mrs. Thorne's lips. "Edward Simmons has been the Carmichael family's physician for 30 years. His loyalty is beyond question. The Carmichaels, the Squire's family, I understand. What connection might they have to Gossamer Cottage?" The herbalist sipped her tea before answering. "The cottage stands on what was once Carmichael land. Sir Philip's great-grandfather sold it under unusual circumstances. Local legend says he couldn't bear to look upon it after what happened there." Miss Marple waited patiently, allowing silence to work its gentle pressure. She had found, over her many years of observing human nature, that people rarely tolerated silence for long. It compelled them to fill the void, often revealing more than they intended. "A young woman died there," Mrs. Thorne continued eventually. "A housemaid named Clara Summers, who worked at the manor. She was found in the cottage garden one morning, surrounded by flowers arranged in a peculiar pattern. The death was ruled a suicide, but there were whispers." "What sort of whispers?" Miss Marple prompted when the herbalist fell silent once more. "That she had been involved with someone from the manor house, that she possessed knowledge that threatened the Carmichael family's position, that her death was neither suicide nor accident, but something far more deliberate. Mrs. Thorne stroked the cat, which had leapt into her lap. These are old stories, Miss Marple. 50 years old, at least. And yet, Miss Marple observed, they seem to cast long shadows still. Millicent was researching this death, wasn't she? She believed Clara's death was connected to something hidden within the cottage, something valuable enough to kill for, both then and now. 2 weeks before she died, Millicent told me she had deciphered part of the pattern in the pressed flower collections. She was jubilant, convinced she was close to discovering what Clara had concealed. Miss Marple thought of the geometric arrangements on Millicent's wall, the similar pattern on her grave, and the solitary orchid delivered in the night. The flowers are a code of some kind, she said, not as a question but as confirmation of her own suspicions. Mrs. Thorne nodded. Millicent believed Clara used the Victorian language of flowers, combined with certain geometric arrangements, to record what she knew. The pressed flowers in the cottage were Clara's work, preserved all these years. And what precisely did Millicent believe Clara knew? The location of evidence, a confession perhaps, or correspondence that implicated someone powerful in a crime long concealed. Mrs. Thorne leaned forward, her voice dropping further. There is a particular plant that grows at Gossamer Cottage, a rare variety of belladonna that produces distinctive purple-black berries. It grows nowhere else in the region, yet flourishes in that garden without cultivation. Miss Marple's mind made the connection swiftly. Poison, she murmured. You're suggesting Clara was poisoned, and the evidence of this was hidden somewhere on the property. Millicent believed so. She was methodically documenting every plant in the garden, comparing them to Clara's pressed specimens, looking for the key to the code. A shadow passed across Mrs. Thorne's face. I should have realized the danger she was placing herself in. You believe her death was not natural, Miss Marple stated. I know it wasn't, the herbalist replied with sudden intensity. The evening before she died, Millicent came to me, excited beyond measure. She said she had finally understood the significance of the ghost orchid in Clara's collection. It was the centerpiece of the code, the key that unlocked the meaning of all the other arrangements. Miss Marple thought of the orchid left on her doorstep. And now someone has delivered the same flower to me with a warning to leave. Someone who knows you're following Millicent's path and fears where it might lead. Mrs. Thorne's eyes held Miss Marple's with urgent purpose. I can help you decipher the flower code. Millicent shared some of her findings with me, though not the final revelation. Between us, perhaps we can finish what she started. Miss Marple considered the offer. It would be most helpful, Mrs. Thorne. Though I wonder if my cousin's death was not natural. Aren't you placing yourself in the same danger by assisting me? A grim smile touched the herbalist's lips. I'm an old woman with few years left to me. Clara's story deserves to be told, and Millicent deserves justice. Some truths must emerge no matter the cost. They spent the next hour examining Millicent's notes, which Mrs. Thorne produced from a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard. The pages detailed various flower combinations and their potential meanings, with particular emphasis on the positioning of certain blooms in relation to others. You see here, Mrs. Thorne pointed to a diagram of overlapping circles formed by pressed violets and foxgloves. Millicent believed this pattern represented the foundation stones of the cottage, and these, she indicated a triangular arrangement of dried bellflowers, suggested a location beneath the hearth. Miss Marple studied the intricate drawings with keen interest, and the ghost orchid. What significance did that hold? That's what Millicent discovered the day before she died. She didn't explain fully, but she said it represented both a warning and a marker, the final piece that showed precisely where Clara had hidden her evidence. As they worked, the morning advanced toward afternoon. Miss Marple was just about to suggest they pause for refreshment when Mrs. Thorne suddenly stiffened, her attention caught by something outside the window. "Sir Philip," she murmured, her expression tightening. He rarely comes to this part of the village. Miss Marple followed her gaze to where a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 60s was making his way along the path that led past Mrs. Thorne's cottage. His bearings suggested authority, a man accustomed to deference. But there was something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of tension rather than confidence. The current squire, Mrs. Thorne explained unnecessarily. His grandfather would have been a young man when Clara died. They watched in silence as he passed, his attention seemingly focused on the middle distance. Yet Miss Marple didn't miss the quick, assessing glance he cast toward the herbalist's cottage, a look that contained both wariness and calculation. "He knows you're here, Mrs." Thorne said once he had disappeared from view. "Word travels swiftly in lower misting." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, reflecting on the various ripples her arrival had already created in the village's tranquil surface. "Mrs. Thorne, I wonder if I might take these notes with me to study further. I promise to guard them carefully." The herbalist hesitated, then nodded. "Take them, but be vigilant, Miss Marple. If Millicent was right about what Clara hid, there are those who would go to extreme lengths to ensure it remains concealed." Miss Marple carefully tucked the papers into her handbag. "I shall come again tomorrow if I may. Perhaps by then I will have made some progress with the code." They parted with the understanding of allies in a common cause. As Miss Marple made her way back through the village, she was conscious of being observed from behind curtains and through shop windows. Lower misting was taking her measure, just as she was taking its. She diverted her path to visit the churchyard once more, drawn by an instinct she had learned to trust over her many years of detecting human malice beneath placid surfaces. Clara Summers's grave, if it existed, might offer additional insights. The old section of the cemetery proved fruitful. After 20 minutes of careful searching, Miss Marple located a modest stone bearing the name Clara Summers and the dates that confirmed she had died young, only 22. What struck Miss Marple, however, was not the inscription but what grew beside the grave, a small patch of belladonna, its deadly berries glistening black in the afternoon sun. "How very interesting," she murmured to herself, making a mental note to include this detail in her evening's contemplations. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though Miss Marple's mind remained active, connecting threads and considering possibilities. She prepared a simple dinner from the provisions she had purchased in the village shop, noting with wry amusement the shopkeeper's barely concealed curiosity about her presence in Lower Misting. As darkness fell, she found herself drawn once more to the pressed flower arrangements on Millicent's bedroom wall. Armed with her cousin's notes and her own observations, she began to detect certain patterns that had eluded her before, the way certain flowers always appeared in proximity to others, the precise angles at which stems crossed, the deliberate spacing between blooms. "Oh," she exclaimed softly, as realization dawned. "It's not just the flowers themselves, it's their positioning. The code works on multiple levels." Energized by this insight, she worked late into the evening, making careful notes of her own. Eventually, fatigue compelled her to set the work aside. Tomorrow she would share her discoveries with Mrs. Thorne, and perhaps together they could make the final breakthrough that had cost Millicent her life. Morning brought grey skies and a fine mist that veiled the garden in gauzy mystery. Miss Marple dressed and breakfasted early, eager to resume her investigation. She had just gathered her notes when an urgent knocking at the front door startled her. It was Dr. Simmons, his normally composed features drawn with concern. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "Mrs. Thorne has been found unconscious in her garden. I've come directly from attending her." "Good heavens," Miss Marple gasped. "What has happened?" The doctor's expression was grave. "Poison," he said flatly. "A rare toxin derived from a plant that grows only at Gossamer Cottage." Chapter 5. The Hidden Journal. Miss Marple's hands remained perfectly steady as she poured tea for Dr. Simmons, though her mind whirled with implications. They had returned to Gossamer Cottage after a brief, unsettling visit to the village infirmary, where Mrs. Thorne lay suspended between consciousness and oblivion, her weathered face ashen against the starched white pillows. "Deadly nightshade, Doctor," Simmons explained, accepting the teacup with a tight nod. "But not the common variety. A rare subspecies with distinctive properties. The toxin works more slowly, mimicking other conditions. Had I not recognized the specific pupil dilation pattern, I might have mistaken it for a stroke. And this plant grows only here, at Gossamer Cottage?" Miss Marple inquired, her voice gentle yet precise. "Yes, an anomaly that Millicent found fascinating from a botanical perspective." He hesitated, studying Miss Marple with new consideration. Mrs. Thorne was conscious briefly. She spoke your name. The silence that followed held a weight beyond words. Through the cottage window, mist curled around the ancient birch trees like spectral fingers, obscuring the garden where deadly beauty flourished. "Dr. Simmons," Miss Marple said at last, "I believe the time for polite evasions has passed. Mrs. Thorne was poisoned because she shared information with me, information concerning a death that occurred in this cottage 50 years ago." The doctor's expression remained impassive, but a subtle tightening around his eyes betrayed his discomfort. Miss Summer's death was ruled a suicide by the coroner of the time. Indeed, a ruling that some in the village apparently still question. Dr. Simmons set down his cup with deliberate care. "Miss Marple, I advised you to sell this cottage and return to St. Mary Mead. That advice was not offered lightly." "No," she agreed. "I rather imagined it wasn't. Tell me, does Sir Philip know that I've been discussing local history with Mrs. Thorne?" A fleeting expression, surprise perhaps, or wariness crossed his features. "Sir Philip concerns himself with matters of greater importance than village gossip. And yet," Miss Marple observed, "he found occasion to walk past Mrs. Thorne's cottage yesterday morning, just as we were examining certain papers of interest." The silence stretched between them, taut as a violin string. When Dr. Simmons finally spoke, his voice had acquired a brittleness that had not been present before. "Lower misting protects its own, Miss Marple. Remember that." He rose to leave, adding with apparent casualness, "I've administered an antidote to Mrs. Thorne. She should recover, given time and rest. I suggest you focus on arranging for the disposal of this property rather than disturbing matters long settled." After he departed, Miss Marple remained motionless in her chair, her alert eyes fixed on the middle distance, as she sorted through the tangled threads of circumstance. Two women, Millicent and Mrs. Thorne, had delved into the past and paid a steep price for their curiosity. The connection to the Carmichael family seemed increasingly significant, as did the elaborate flower code that somehow pointed to evidence hidden within the cottage. "Well," she said at last to the empty room, "I believe a more thorough search is in order." She began methodically, dividing the cottage into sections and examining each with painstaking attention to detail. The sitting room yielded nothing beyond what she had already observed. The kitchen, with its collection of herb jars and dried botanicals, revealed only Millicent's orderly housekeeping. Upstairs, the second bedroom, clearly used as a study, contained bookshelves laden with volumes on local history, botany, and folklore, but nothing that struck her as deliberately concealed. It was in Millicent's bedroom, as the afternoon light began to fade, that Miss Marple's persistence was rewarded. The ornate oak wardrobe, its doors carved with stylized flowers that echoed the pressed arrangements on the wall, drew her particular attention. Running her fingers along the interior, she detected a slight inconsistency in the wood at the back panel, a seam so skillfully crafted that it would escape casual observation. Gentle pressure at precisely the right point caused the panel to yield, revealing a shallow recess behind. Within lay a leather-bound journal, its covers worn with handling. Miss Marple withdrew it carefully, aware that she held the culmination of Millicent's research, and quite possibly the reason for her death. She carried her discovery downstairs, placing it on the kitchen table where the light was better. A preliminary examination revealed densely written pages in Millicent's hand, interspersed with pressed flower specimens, diagrams, and occasional newspaper clippings. The earliest entries dated back several months, beginning with Millicent's first suspicions about Clara Summer's death. March 15th found another reference to C.S. in parish records. Employed at Carmichael Manor from age 16, died age 22. Suicide by drowning, according to inquest. Body discovered in Gossamer Cottage garden by groundskeeper. No family to question findings. Buried in parish churchyard with minimal ceremony. March 20th. Curious detail from church records. Clara was an accomplished botanist, despite humble origins. Learned from mother who had been lady's maid to a renowned botanical illustrator. Clara apparently collected and preserved specimens, particularly interested in medicinal and toxic varieties. Connection to cottage name. Gossamer, like spider silk, nearly invisible, but of remarkable strength. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at the next entry. April 3rd. Breakthrough. Village records show Thomas Carmichael, present Sir Philip's grandfather, sold cottage shortly after Clara's death, despite property being in family for generations. New structure, built on original foundation. Why maintain the building but distance family ownership? Found curious reference in parish council minutes to unfortunate associations necessitating change of ownership while preserving structure for reasons of historical significance. As she turned the pages, Miss Marple traced Millicent's methodical investigation, her growing certainty that Clara Summers had been murdered to conceal a scandal involving the Carmichael family, her discovery of the pressed flower collection hidden in the cottage walls during renovations, and her painstaking efforts to decipher their meaning. May 10th. Each arrangement is deliberate, not aesthetic, but informational. Clara was using Victorian flower language combined with geometric positioning to record something she witnessed. The foxglove, insincerity positioned beside myrtle betrayal and crossed by stems of tansy hostile thoughts, suggests conflict between C and someone she trusted. Confirms certain specimens likely came from Carmichael Manor gardens, not cottage grounds. The entries grew more excited as Millicent appeared to make progress with the code. June 18th. The central pattern, I've been interpreting it incorrectly, not pointing to locations within the garden, but within the cottage itself. The triangular arrangement of belladonna, monkshood, and lily of the valley, all highly toxic, forms a precise map when overlaid on the cottage foundation plan. They indicate the hearth, specifically the cornerstone beneath it. The final entries displayed an increasing urgency. July 2nd, received response from Historical Society regarding T. Carmichael activities, summer of 1874. He was indeed in residence at Manor, had recently returned from Oxford with college friend name redacted in records. Local newspaper mentions distinguished visitor staying with family, then abrupt departure due to urgent family matters. Within week, Clara found dead. Coincidence? July 5th, ghost orchid found preserved at center of main flower arrangement, not native to England, must have been gift from someone well-traveled. In Victorian flower language represents dangerous secrets. Positioning within arrangement suggests it marks exact location of hidden item. Must check foundation stones tomorrow at first light. The final entry, dated the day before Millicent's death, contained just 3 lines. July 8th. Found it. Letter confirms everything. Must contact authorities immediately. Cannot trust local police or doctor. Implications reach beyond lower misting. Miss Marple closed the journal, her mind working to arrange these revelations into a coherent pattern. Millicent had discovered evidence linking the Carmichael family to Clara's death. Evidence deliberately hidden by Clara herself before she was killed. And now someone had attempted to silence Mrs. Thorne using the same method employed against Clara 50 years earlier. The cottage had grown dark while she read, shadows pooling in the corners. Miss Marple lit the lamps, unwilling to leave any corner in darkness. The journal represented both illumination and danger. It confirmed her suspicions but placed her in the same perilous position that had claimed Millicent's life. Her natural caution warred with her determination to uncover the truth. The hearth, that was where Clara had hidden her evidence, where Millicent had made her fatal discovery. Miss Marple moved to the fireplace, examining it with renewed attention. The stone construction appeared solid, the massive hearthstone seemingly immovable. And yet, if Clara had hidden something beneath it, there must be a way to access the space without dismantling the entire structure. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the mortar lines, seeking inconsistencies similar to those she had found in the wardrobe. Nothing yielded to her touch. She sat back on her heels, considering the problem from Clara's perspective. A young woman with limited time and resources, fearing for her life yet determined to preserve evidence, how would she create an accessible hiding place that would nonetheless escape casual detection? The answer came as she studied the cast-iron fire grate. Unlike the hearth itself, the grate was not fixed in place, but could be lifted out for cleaning if the space beneath had been subtly altered. With effort, Miss Marple removed the heavy grate and set it aside. The hearthstone beneath appeared ordinary at first glance, but closer inspection revealed one corner where the mortar was slightly different in color and texture from the rest. Using a kitchen knife as an improvised tool, she carefully scraped away the newer mortar until she could work her fingers into the gap and lift. The corner of the hearthstone rose reluctantly, revealing a small cavity beneath. Within lay a packet wrapped in oilskin and sealed with wax preservation measures that had protected the contents across the decades. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she withdrew it, conscious that she was touching an object that had cost at least 2 lives. At that precise moment, a floorboard creaked behind her. Chapter 6. The pattern of pressed flowers. Miss Marple did not turn immediately. Years of observing human nature had taught her that sometimes stillness revealed more than action. The quality of the silence behind her, tense, expectant, told her much about her unseen visitor. "Dr. Simmons," she said quietly, "I rather thought you might return." She rose with deliberate slowness, the oilskin packet concealed within the folds of her cardigan, as she turned to face the village doctor. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway, his medical bag clutched in one hand. "You've been quite thorough, Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying a new edge that confirmed her suspicions. "More thorough than is entirely wise." "Yes," she replied, moving toward the table where Millicent's journal lay open. "I've always found that thoroughness reveals what casual observation obscures. Rather like your specialized knowledge of rare botanical toxins." His expression hardened. "I came to check on you. Given recent events, it seemed prudent." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple murmured. "And does Sir Philip share your concern for my welfare?" A flicker of something, alarm perhaps, crossed his features. "Sir Philip has nothing to do with this." "Oh, but I think he does," she countered, her mild tone belying the precision of her words. "Not the current Sir Philip, perhaps, but certainly his grandfather. The evidence that Clara Summers concealed, evidence that my cousin discovered, implicates Thomas Carmichael directly in her death." Simmons stepped fully into the room, setting his bag on a chair with careful deliberation. "You've been listening to village superstitions, Miss Marple, hardly becoming for a woman of your intelligence. Not superstitions, Doctor. Facts, meticulously documented by my cousin." She gestured toward the journal. Millicent was remarkably thorough in her investigation. She discovered that Clara Summers had witnessed something involving Thomas Carmichael and his Oxford friend, something so damaging that she was silenced permanently. The doctor's composure slipped momentarily. Whatever Clara Summers may have witnessed, it happened 50 years ago. The parties involved are long dead, yet the consequences persist, Miss Marple observed. Family reputations, inheritances, positions of influence, all potentially threatened by the truth. Even now, outside the wind had risen, rustling through the garden and causing the old cottage to creak and whisper around them. The pressed flowers in their frames seemed to stir in the shifting lamplight, their secret patterns momentarily animated. "What exactly did you find beneath the hearth?" Simmons asked, his eyes fixing on the slight bulge in her cardigan where the packet rested. "A letter," Miss Marple replied truthfully. "A confession, in fact, written by Thomas Carmichael himself. Clara preserved it as insurance, evidence that might protect her. She underestimated the lengths to which a powerful family would go to preserve its reputation." The doctor seemed to come to a decision. He opened his medical bag, and Miss Marple was not surprised to see him withdraw, not a medical instrument but a small revolver. "I'm afraid I must insist you hand over whatever you've found," he said, the pretense of concern entirely abandoned now. "The past should remain buried, Miss Marple. Surely at your age you appreciate that some secrets serve no purpose in being revealed." "On the contrary," she replied with remarkable composure for a woman facing a firearm, "I find that secrets fester when concealed, poisoning everything they touch, rather like the rare belladonna that grows in this garden. The same plant used to poison Mrs. Thorne, I imagine, and perhaps my cousin as well." A thin smile crossed his lips. "Heart failure is notoriously difficult to diagnose precisely in elderly women, particularly those with pre-existing conditions." The implication hung in the air between them. Miss Marple studied him with the detached curiosity that had served her so well in previous investigations. "You're not acting on your own initiative," she stated. "Sir Philip sent you to retrieve the evidence." "Sir Philip knows nothing about this," Dr. Simmons insisted, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "This is about protecting the village, Miss Marple. Lower Misting depends on the Carmichael estate. A scandal from the past could destroy everything, even at the cost of 3 women's lives." Miss Marple asked quietly. "Clara, Millicent, and now Mrs. Thorne." "Mrs. Thorne will recover," he said dismissively. "As for you, well, a tragic accident befalling an elderly lady in an unfamiliar cottage. Regrettable, but hardly suspicious." Miss Marple's hand moved slightly toward the table lamp beside her. "Before you proceed with whatever you're planning, Dr. Simmons, perhaps you should know that I've already shared copies of Millicent's most significant findings with Inspector Craddock of the County Police. This was, in fact, a fabrication, but one delivered with such conviction that uncertainty flickered across the doctor's face. "You're bluffing," he said after a moment. "There hasn't been time. I assure you I arrived in Lower Misting with certain precautions already in place," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Mary Mead have taught me that human nature remains constant across even the most picturesque settings." As she spoke, the faint sound of an automobile engine broke the silence outside. Simmons' head turned reflexively toward the window, and in that moment of distraction Miss Marple acted. Her fingers closed around the heavy brass lamp base, and with surprising strength for her slight frame, she swung it toward his outstretched arm. The impact sent the revolver clattering to the floor. Dr. Simmons let out a cry of pain and surprise as the front door burst open, revealing Inspector Craddock, solid, dependable Inspector Craddock, whose appearance in the doorway of Gossamer Cottage could only be described as providential. "Perfect timing, Inspector," Miss Marple said with evident relief. Dr. Simmons was just about to explain his connection to certain events of interest. Later, seated in the cottage kitchen with a revived tea tray before them, Miss Marple detailed the entire case for Inspector Craddock. The oilskin packet, now carefully preserved in an evidence envelope, contained Thomas Carmichael's written confession to the murder of a young man, his Oxford friend's younger brother, in a drunken altercation at the manor. Clara Summers had witnessed the incident, and her knowledge had sealed her fate. The pressed flowers were her insurance, Miss Marple explained, her way of ensuring that if anything happened to her, the truth might eventually emerge. Each arrangement was part of a map leading to the hidden confession, with the ghost orchid, a gift from the murdered young man, who had traveled in tropical regions, marking the precise location. "And your cousin deciphered this code?" Craddock asked, shaking his head in admiration, using her knowledge of botanical classifications and Victorian flower language. Yes. What she couldn't have known was that Dr. Simmons has been the Carmichael family physician for decades, privy to their secrets, and dedicated to preserving their position. The entire village conspired to maintain the silence, Craddock observed. Not conspiracy so much as complicity, Miss Marple corrected gently. In small communities, dependence often breeds a willingness to look away from uncomfortable truths. Lower Misting has relied on the Carmichael estate for generations. The inspector glanced at the packet. This evidence is 50 years old, Miss Marple. The actual murderer is long deceased. Yes, she agreed, but the cover-up has claimed 2 more recent victims, my cousin Millicent and very nearly Mrs. Thorne. Those crimes fall well within your jurisdiction, Inspector. As dawn broke over Gossamer Cottage, Miss Marple stood in the garden, observing the delicate interplay of light and shadow among the plants that had witnessed so much across the decades. The deadly nightshade grew innocently among more benign specimens, its beauty concealing its lethal nature, much like the secrets that had festered in Lower Misting for half a century. Justice would come for Clara Summers at last, and for Millicent too. The pressed flowers had finally yielded their long-hidden message, the gossamer threads connecting past and present, finally made visible in the clear light of truth. Miss Marple smiled softly to herself. She would return to St. Mary Mead soon enough, but not before ensuring that all the tangled threads of this particular mystery were properly unraveled. After all, as she often reflected, human nature, with all its capacity for both extraordinary evil and remarkable courage, remained fascinatingly consistent, whether in her beloved village or here in the misted valleys of Somerset.